They said, "I'm the mama now," she told the cowboy, while wrapping her brother in a torn blanket. Welcome back to our channel, friends. Before we dive into today's heart-wrenching tale from the American frontier, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. And please, drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're listening from. We love connecting with our global audience. Now, settle in for a story that will touch your soul. The November wind cut through the Colorado Territory like a blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Jake Morrison pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his shoulders as his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Senna, picked her way carefully down the rocky trail. 23 years on the frontier had taught him to read the signs. Those dark clouds gathering on the horizon meant trouble, and he needed to find shelter before nightfall. Jake had been riding for 3 days straight, delivering a herd of cattle to a ranch near Denver. The job was done, his saddlebags heavy with hard-earned coins, and now he was heading south toward warmer territory. At 31, he'd seen enough of these mountain winters to know when to retreat. His weathered face, marked by countless days under the unforgiving sun, scanned the landscape ahead. The trail wound through a valley dotted with abandoned homesteads, dreams broken by harsh winters, failed crops, or worse. As Senna crested a small ridge, Jake spotted something that made him rein in sharply. Below, nestled against a cluster of bare cottonwood trees, sat a ramshackle cabin with smoke rising weakly from its chimney. But it wasn't the cabin that caught his attention. It was the small figure huddled on the front porch, barely visible in the gathering dusk. Jake's instincts, honed by years of careful survival, told him to ride on. Getting involved in other people's troubles had a way of creating problems, and he'd learned long ago that in this country, minding your own business was often the difference between living and dying. But something about the scene below nagged at him. The figure was too small, too still. He urged Senna down the slope, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the worn grip of his Colt .45. As they drew closer, details emerged that made his chest tighten. The figure was a girl, couldn't be more than 10 years old, sitting on the sagging porch steps. She wore a dress that might have once been blue, but was now faded to grey, and her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face that was far too serious for her age. In her arms, she held a bundle wrapped in what appeared to be a torn blanket. The bundle was moving slightly, and Jake caught the faint sound of an infant's cry carried on the wind. The girl looked up as he approached, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they held a weariness that no child should possess. There was no fear in her gaze as she watched him dismount, only a careful assessment, as if she were measuring his intentions. "Evening, miss," Jake said softly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He'd learned that frightened children were like wild animals. Sudden movements could send them bolting. Mighty cold night to be sitting outside. The girl adjusted her grip on the bundle, and Jake could see now that it was indeed a baby, probably no more than a few months old. The child's face was red from crying, and even from several feet away, Jake could see that both children were too thin, their cheeks hollow with hunger. "They said, 'I'm the mama now,'" the girl said quietly, her voice carrying a matter-of-fact tone that chilled Jake more than the wind. She looked down at the baby in her arms, then back up at the stranger on horseback. "Been 3 days since Papa didn't wake up." The simple statement hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd encountered plenty of hardship on the frontier, but something about this child's calm acceptance of her situation cut deep. She wasn't crying or pleading, she was simply stating facts, as if caring for a baby at age 10 was the most natural thing in the world. "What's your name, little miss?" Jake asked, crouching down to bring himself closer to her eye level. "Sarah," she replied. "This is my brother Tommy. He's been crying a lot, but I think he's just hungry." Jake glanced toward the cabin. The door hung slightly ajar, and he could smell something beyond just wood smoke, the sickly sweet scent that often accompanied death. His jaw clenched as the full scope of the situation became clear. "Your mama?" he asked gently. "She's been gone since Tommy was born," Sarah said, tucking the blanket more securely around her brother. Papa tried real hard to take care of us both, but he's been sick for weeks. Yesterday morning he just didn't get up. The wind picked up, causing the baby to cry louder. Sarah began to rock him gently, humming a soft tune that Jake recognized as an old lullaby. Watching her, this tiny girl trying to mother a baby while sitting next to what was essentially a tomb, something fundamental shifted in Jake Morrison's carefully constructed world. He'd built his life around the principle of self-preservation. Don't get attached, don't take on responsibilities you can't handle, and always keep moving. It had served him well through years of Indian raids, cattle rustling, and the general lawlessness of frontier life. But as he looked at Sarah and baby Tommy, those principles seemed suddenly hollow. "Sarah," he said carefully, "have you eaten anything today?" She shook her head. "Been trying to find something for Tommy. Papa had some canned milk, but it's all gone now. I don't know what babies eat." Jake's decision was made before he fully realized it. Some lines, once crossed, changed a man forever. As the first snowflakes began to fall from the darkening sky, he knew he was about to cross one of those lines. "Well then," Jake said, standing slowly, "first thing we need to do is get you both inside where it's warm." He gestured toward the cabin. "Mind if I take a look around? Make sure everything's safe?" Sarah nodded, struggling to stand while holding Tommy. Jake instinctively reached out to steady her, noting how light she felt, like a bird that might blow away in the wind. The baby had stopped crying for the moment, but Jake could see he was listless, his little face pale and drawn. Inside the cabin, Jake's fears were confirmed. Sarah's father lay still on the single bed, covered with a threadbare quilt. The man looked to be in his 40s, his face gaunt from illness and hardship. Jake quickly assessed the rest of the space. One room with a stone fireplace, a small table, 2 chairs, and shelves that were mostly bare. A few cans sat on the counter, but not enough to last more than a day or two. "Sarah," Jake said gently, "we're going to need to take care of your papa properly. Do you understand what I mean?" The girl nodded solemnly. "I know he's dead, mister. I'm not stupid. I didn't know what to do with him. And Tommy needed taking care of." Jake marveled at her composure. Most adults would be falling apart in this situation, but this child was handling it with a strength that humbled him. "You've done real good taking care of your brother. Your papa would be proud." While Sarah sat in one of the chairs, rocking Tommy, Jake went outside to tend to the grim necessity of burial. The ground was already hardening with frost, making the work difficult, but he managed to dig a shallow grave behind the cabin. He wrapped Sarah's father in the quilt and said a few words over the site, with Sarah standing beside him holding her brother. "Papa always said, 'The Lord looks after those who can't look after themselves,'" she said quietly, as Jake finished covering the grave with stones to keep animals away. "Your papa was a wise man," Jake replied, though privately he wondered where the Lord had been when these children needed looking after most. Back inside the cabin, Jake built up the fire and heated water in a dented pot. He found some jerky in his saddlebags and softened it in the warm water, then showed Sarah how to give small pieces to Tommy. "The babies need milk mostly," Jake explained, "but this will help until we can figure something else out." As he watched Sarah patiently feeding her brother, Jake's mind raced through possibilities. The nearest town was Silverton, about 2 days' ride south, but winter was coming fast. Taking 2 children on that journey in this weather could be fatal. There was an abandoned ranch about half a day's ride east. The Hendersons had pulled out last spring after losing their cattle to rustlers. The buildings were still sound, and there might be supplies left behind. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I'm thinking we might need to move somewhere safer, warmer. Would you trust me to take you and Tommy somewhere better?" The girl studied his face for a long moment, and Jake felt as if she were reading his very soul. Finally, she nodded. "You got kind eyes, mister, and you buried Papa proper. I think he'd say you're all right. Name's Jake Morrison," he said, extending his hand, "and I give you my word, I'll see you both safe." Sarah shook his hand solemnly, her small fingers nearly disappearing in his calloused palm. "They said, 'I'm the mama now,'" she repeated, "but I reckon maybe I don't have to be the only grown-up anymore." Jake felt his throat tighten. "No, little miss. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." As the snow began falling harder outside, Jake made plans. They'd leave at first light for the Henderson place. It wasn't much, but it would give them shelter while he figured out what to do long term. Looking at Sarah as she hummed softly to her brother, Jake realized his life had just taken a turn he never could have anticipated. 24 hours ago, he'd been a solitary drifter with no responsibilities beyond his horse and his own survival. Now, he was responsible for 2 children in the middle of nowhere, with winter closing in fast. Most men would call it foolishness, but as he watched Sarah's gentle care of baby Tommy, Jake found he didn't much care what most men would think. Dawn came grey and cold, with snow falling steadily. Jake had spent most of the night awake, alternating between feeding the fire and watching over the children. Sarah had curled up on the floor near the hearth with Tommy, both of them sharing Jake's bedroll. Every few hours, the baby would wake crying, and Sarah would tend to him with a patience that continued to amaze Jake. "Time to go, little miss," Jake said softly, gently shaking Sarah's shoulder. "Or do we need to get moving before this snow gets worse?" Sarah sat up immediately, instantly alert. "Is Tommy okay?" He felt warm during the night. Jake knelt beside them, feeling the baby's forehead with the back of his hand. Tommy was indeed warm, though whether from fever or just being bundled up, he couldn't tell. He seems all right, but we need to get him somewhere warmer and find him proper food soon." While Sarah gathered the few belongings worth taking, a photograph of her parents, her father's pocket watch, and a small wooden horse that had obviously been carved with love, Jake loaded his saddlebags with what little food remained in the cabin. It wasn't much: 2 cans of beans, some hardtack, and a small bag of coffee beans. The challenge was how to transport everyone safely. Senna was a strong horse, but carrying 3 people over rough terrain in snow would be asking a lot. Jake fashioned a makeshift sling from rope and his spare blanket, creating a carrier he could wear across his chest to hold Tommy. It would keep the baby warm and leave Sarah's hands free to hold on to Jake while riding. "This is going to be a hard ride," Jake warned as he helped Sarah onto Senna's back. "You'll need to hold on tight, and if you start feeling too cold, you tell me right away." "I've ridden before," Sarah said, settling herself behind the saddle. "Papa used to take me to town sometimes." Jake carefully secured Tommy in the makeshift carrier, marveling at how light the baby felt. Too light. They needed to get him proper nutrition soon, or the child wouldn't survive much longer. As they set out into the swirling snow, Jake sent up a silent prayer to whatever god might be listening. The trail to Henderson Ranch was treacherous under the best conditions. Now, with snow obscuring familiar landmarks and the wind howling through the pines, it was downright dangerous. Jake had to rely on instinct and years of experience to navigate. Senna picked her way carefully over icy rocks and through snow-laden brush, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. After 2 hours of riding, Sarah's small voice cut through the wind. "Mr. Jake, Tommy's not moving much." Jake's heart clenched as he looked down at the baby. Tommy's lips had a bluish tinge, and his breathing seemed shallow. They needed shelter, and they needed it now. "There should be a line shack about a mile ahead," Jake called back to Sarah. "Can you hold on a little longer?" "Yes, sir," came the determined reply. The line shack, when they finally reached it, was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it had a small stone fireplace and protection from the wind. Jake quickly got a fire going while Sarah unwrapped Tommy from the carrier. The baby's skin felt cold to the touch, and he was barely responsive. "Is he dying?" Sarah asked, her voice small but steady. Jake heated water and soaked some more jerky, creating a thin broth. "Not if I can help it," he said grimly. "We're going to warm him up and get some food in him." For the next hour, they worked together to bring Tommy back from the edge. Jake held the baby close to his chest, sharing his body heat, while Sarah patiently fed him tiny drops of warm broth. Gradually, color returned to the child's cheeks, and he began to cry, a weak but encouraging sound. "There's my boy," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You scared me, Tommy." As they waited for the storm to ease, Jake found himself studying Sarah's face in the firelight. Despite everything she'd been through, There was still something essentially childlike about her, the way she made faces at Tommy to get him to smile, how she unconsciously sucked on her lower lip when concentrating. But there was also a maturity that broke Jake's heart, a careful way she watched adults for cues about how to behave. "But Sarah," Jake said gently, "tell me about before. When your mama was still alive?" A soft smile crossed the girl's face. "Mama used to sing all the time. She had the prettiest voice. She'd sing while she cooked, while she did washing, while she rocked Tommy. Papa said she could charm birds right out of the trees with her singing." "What happened to her?" "She got real sick after Tommy was born. Papa said sometimes that happens to mamas. She just got weaker and weaker until one day she went to sleep and didn't wake up." Sarah's voice remained matter-of-fact, but Jake could see the pain in her eyes. "That's when Papa started getting sick too. I think he missed her so much it made him sick inside." Jake nodded, understanding more than Sarah probably realized. He'd seen men die of broken hearts before, especially on the frontier where life was already hanging by a thread. "You know," Jake said carefully, "your mama and papa would want you to be taken care of proper, not just you taking care of Tommy, but someone taking care of you too." Sarah looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe when we get through this winter, we ought to think about finding you a real home. A family that could adopt you both, give you schooling, make sure you grow up right." For the first time since he'd met her, Sarah's composure cracked. Her eyes filled with tears, and her voice trembled. "You don't want us?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. "Oh, honey, it's not that. It's just, I'm not the kind of man who knows how to raise children. I live rough, move around a lot. You deserve better than that." "But what if they separate us?" Sarah whispered. "No. What if they don't want Tommy because he's just a baby and needs so much care?" Jake hadn't considered that possibility, but he realized Sarah was right to worry. Finding a family willing to take both children might be difficult, and the thought of them being separated made his chest tight with an emotion he didn't want to examine too closely. "Let's just focus on getting through this winter first," he said finally. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." But even as he said the words, Jake was beginning to realize that his own feelings about the situation were more complicated than he'd initially thought. The Henderson Ranch appeared through the swirling snow like a ghost from the past. The main house stood dark and empty, its windows like hollow eyes staring across the valley. But the structure was solid, built to withstand harsh winters, and Jake felt a wave of relief as they approached. "Is this where we're going to live?" Sarah asked, her voice muffled by the scarf Jake had wrapped around her face. "For now," Jake replied, studying the buildings. There was the main house, a smaller bunkhouse, a barn, and what looked like a smokehouse. If the Hendersons had left any supplies behind, they might have enough to make it through the winter. Jake helped Sarah down from Senna, then carefully lifted Tommy from the carrier. The baby had recovered somewhat during their rest at the line shack, but he was still worryingly thin and weak. They needed to get him inside and warm as quickly as possible. The front door to the main house was unlocked. Frontier hospitality dictated that travelers should always be able to find shelter. Inside, dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through dirty windows. The house was simply but solidly built. A main room with a large stone fireplace, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove, and 2 bedrooms. "Look," Sarah said excitedly, pointing to shelves along one wall. "Books!" Jake smiled at her enthusiasm. It was the first truly childlike reaction he'd seen from her. The Hendersons had indeed left books behind, mostly practical volumes about farming and animal husbandry, but also a few novels and what appeared to be a McGuffey reader. While Sarah explored the house with Tommy in her arms, Jake made a systematic search of the property. In the pantry, he found several cans of preserved vegetables, a sack of flour with only minimal weevil damage, some dried beans, and a precious jar of honey. The barn yielded even greater treasures, a milk cow that had somehow survived on her own, several chickens that had gone wild but could be caught, and hay for Senna. "Sarah!" Jake called excitedly. "Come see what I found." The girl appeared in the barn doorway, still carrying Tommy. When she saw the cow, her eyes widened. "Does this mean Tommy can have real milk?" "It sure does," Jake said, already planning how to rig up a milking setup. "And those chickens mean fresh eggs. We're going to do just fine here." Over the next few days, They established a routine that gradually began to feel like something approaching normal life. Jake cleaned out the main house, while Sarah organized their meager belongings. He taught her how to milk the cow, a skill that came naturally to her, despite her small hands. She showed him how to make Tommy's feedings more efficient, mixing the cow's milk with a little honey and warm water. The baby began to thrive almost immediately on the regular nutrition. His cheeks filled out, his eyes grew brighter, and he started making the cooing sounds that healthy babies make. Watching Sarah's face light up when Tommy smiled for the first time was worth all the trouble Jake had taken on, but it wasn't all easy. The first major challenge came during their second week at the ranch, when a pack of wolves began circling the property at night. Jake had been expecting this. The abandoned ranch would have attracted scavengers, and the presence of livestock made them a target. "And stay in the house with Tommy," Jake told Sarah as he prepared to defend their small herd. "No matter what you hear, don't come outside." "What if something happens to you?" Sarah asked, her face pale with worry. "Nothing's going to happen to me," Jake said with more confidence than he felt. "But if it does, you take Tommy and hide in the root cellar until morning. Then you ride Senna to the nearest town and tell them what happened." That night, Jake sat in the barn with his rifle, listening to the wolves prowl around the perimeter. They were testing him, looking for weakness. Around midnight, they made their move, rushing the chicken coop in a coordinated attack. Jake's first shot dropped the lead wolf, and his second scattered the pack, but not before they'd killed 3 of the chickens. As he dragged the wolf carcass away from the property, Jake realized this was just the beginning. Winter was closing in, and hungry predators would become increasingly bold. The next morning, Sarah surprised him by meeting him at the barn door with a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs. "Figured you'd be hungry after being up all night," she said matter-of-factly. "How did you know I was up all night?" Jake asked. "I watched from the window. I know you told me to stay inside, but I couldn't just go to sleep not knowing if you were safe." Jake felt something warm spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "You don't need to worry about me, little miss." "Yes, I do," Sarah said firmly. "We're family now, aren't we? Family worries about each other." The simple statement stopped Jake cold. Family. He'd been alone for so long that he'd almost forgotten what the word meant. But looking at Sarah's serious face and hearing Tommy's contented babbling from where she'd set him down in a wooden crate lined with blankets, Jake realized she was right. Somewhere between burying her father and teaching her to milk a cow, they had become a family. "Yes," he said quietly, "I guess we are." As November gave way to December, their little household settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. Sarah proved to be remarkably capable for her age. She could cook simple meals, tend to Tommy's needs, and even help Jake with some of the heavier ranch work. In return, Jake began teaching her things her father probably never had time for: how to read the weather, how to handle a rifle, how to track animals. But it was in the quiet moments that their bond truly deepened. In the evenings, after chores were done and Tommy was asleep, Sarah would read aloud from the books they'd found. Her reading was halting at first, but Jake patiently helped her with difficult words. Sometimes he would tell her stories about his travels, carefully editing out the more dangerous parts. "Tell me about the ocean," Sarah said one snowy evening, curled up next to Jake in front of the fire. "Well," Jake began, "it's bigger than you can imagine. Water as far as you can see in every direction. Blue-green like the sky just before a storm. And it moves constant like waves rolling in and out, making a sound like breathing. Have you really seen it? Once, when I was about your age, my pa took a job moving cattle down to California, and I went with him. I'll never forget the first time I saw those waves." "Will you take me to see it someday?" Sarah asked sleepily. Jake looked down at her, this remarkable child who had somehow wrapped herself around his heart. "Maybe I will," he said softly. "Maybe I will." Outside, the wind howled around the eaves of the old house, but inside they were warm and safe. As Jake watched Sarah's eyes flutter closed and listened to Tommy's peaceful breathing, he realized that for the first time in his adult life, He was truly content, but winter was far from over, and Jake knew that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. February brought the worst blizzard Jake had ever experienced. For 3 days, the wind screamed around the ranch house like a living thing, and snow piled so high against the windows that the interior was plunged into an eerie twilight. Jake had to dig a tunnel just to reach the barn to tend to the animals. On the second day of the storm, Tommy developed a fever. Sarah noticed it first. Her small hand pressed against her brother's forehead as she tried to feed him his morning bottle. "Mr. Jake," she called, her voice tight with worry. "Something's wrong with Tommy." Jake hurried over, and his heart sank when he felt the baby's burning skin. Tommy was listless, barely responsive, and his breathing seemed labored. In town, they would call for a doctor, but the nearest medical help was 2 days away in good weather. In this blizzard, they might as well be on the moon. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her composure finally cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. Jake gathered both children in his arms, his mind racing through everything he'd learned about caring for sick babies during his travels. "We fight," he said firmly. "We keep him cool, get fluids in him, and we don't give up." For the next 36 hours, Jake and Sarah worked in shifts to care for Tommy. They bathed him with cool water, forced small amounts of liquid into him, and took turns holding him when he cried. Sarah sang every lullaby she knew, her young voice hoarse from exhaustion. During the long night watches, Jake found himself praying to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. He made bargains and promises, offering up his own life if it would save this innocent child who had come to mean everything to him. Please don't take him," Sarah whispered, during one particularly bad spell when Tommy's fever spiked and he became completely unresponsive. "He's all I got left of Mama and Papa. He's not all you have," Jake said quietly, surprising himself with the words. "You've got me, and I'm not going anywhere." Sarah looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed far too old for her face. You promise?" "I promise," Jake said, and as the words left his mouth, he realized he meant them completely. Somewhere during these months of shared responsibility and quiet moments, his priorities had shifted entirely. The solitary life he'd lived for so long seemed empty and meaningless compared to this, caring for these children who needed him. On the third morning, Tommy's fever finally broke. He opened his eyes and looked around with curiosity, rather than the glazed confusion of illness. When Sarah offered him his bottle, he took it eagerly, drinking deeply for the first time in days. "He's going to be all right," Jake said, relief flooding through him so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. Sarah threw her arms around Jake's neck, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I can't lose him too." "You won't," Jake promised, holding her tight. "I won't let anything happen to either of you. Not ever." When the storm finally passed, Jake made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a few months earlier. Instead of planning to move on when spring came, he began making improvements to the ranch as if he intended to stay permanently. He repaired the roof, fixed broken fences, and even started planning a garden for the coming growing season. "Are we really staying here forever?" Sarah asked one afternoon as she watched Jake replace rotted boards on the front porch. "Would you like that?" Jake asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I think Mama and Papa would want us to have a real home, and Tommy needs a place to grow up safe. What about you? What do you need?" For the first time in months, Sarah smiled with pure childhood joy. "I need you to teach me how to rope cattle like you promised, and I want to learn to read all those books in the house, and someday I want you to take us to see the ocean." Jake set down his hammer and pulled Sarah onto his lap. "You know, I've been thinking about that. Maybe we could take a trip to California when Tommy's older, see some of that country, meet some people, but we'd come back here. This is our home now," Jake said firmly. "We'd always come back here." As spring arrived early that year, the ranch began to feel truly alive again. Jake managed to catch and tame several wild horses that had been roaming the valley, giving them the start of a small herd. Sarah proved to have a natural way with the animals, and Tommy was growing strong and healthy. One evening in late March, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Sarah made an announcement that nearly stopped Jake's heart. "I've been thinking," she said in her serious way. Tommy's going to start talking soon, and he's going to need something to call you. Oh, Jake managed. I think he should call you Papa, if that's all right with you. Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah began to fidget. Finally, she looked up at him with worry in her eyes. Did I say something wrong? No, honey, Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. You said something exactly right. That night, after the children were asleep, Jake sat by the fire thinking about the strange turns life could take. A year ago, he'd been a drifter with no ties and no responsibilities. Now he was a father to 2 children he loved more than his own life. Running a ranch he was determined to make prosperous. He thought about Sarah's mother, who had died bringing Tommy into the world, and her father, who had loved his children so much that losing his wife had broken his spirit. Jake made a silent promise to their memory that he would give Sarah and Tommy everything they deserved. Love, security, education, and most importantly, the knowledge that they would never be alone again. Outside, a spring rain began to fall, gentle and warm, washing away the last traces of the brutal winter. Inside, Jake Morrison sat, watching over his sleeping children, and planned for a future he'd never imagined wanting. In the morning, he would start building a proper schoolroom addition to the house. Sarah was bright and deserved a real education. He'd also write to his brother in Denver, the one family member he'd maintained contact with over the years, and tell him about his new life. But for now, it was enough to sit in the quiet house and listen to the peaceful sounds of his family sleeping. Tommy stirred in his crib, making the small noises babies make when they dream. Sarah murmured something in her sleep from the bedroom they'd set up for her. Jake smiled, finally understanding what it meant to be truly wealthy. He had everything that mattered: love, purpose, and a future worth building. As the rain continued to fall softly on the roof of their home, Jake Morrison, former drifter and newly minted father, closed his eyes and dreamed of teaching his son to ride and walking his daughter down the aisle on her wedding day. Some men found their purpose in gold or glory. Jake had found his in the simple words of a 10-year-old girl. They said, "I'm the mama now." But she didn't have to be the only grown-up anymore. She had him, and she always would. The end.